that would give light. So they found a hide, and as far as I can tell, it was a deer hide that they thought would brighten the earth. And so they did that, and when they made it, then they placed it up in the heaven dome.
Great future for humanity off-planet, and we need to set about sharpening the skills that it takes for humans to learn how to live further and further away from the Earth. One of these days, one of these years, one of these centuries, people will look back on these years and marvel. I don't think we really understand the significance what happened 25 years ago.
I was working for a department in the central part of Florida, and we had a duty in an orange grove where there was people stealing oranges, and we had to stake it out to catch them. And I remember laying in that orange grove night after night and watching the Russian Sputnik go over. And there was a great feeling among everybody that I talked to in my police work that the United States could not be second. We could not be second. We knew that Russia was trying to put a man on the moon. We knew this. And it just seemed to be the criteria. We got to be first. We got to be first.
For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom. And therefore we intend to be first.
The first message that Gagarin got on his flight was, let the capitalist beat that. That until we landed men on the moon, the Russians would beat us in everything. They'd have the biggest rocket. They would have more men in space. They would have more accomplishments in space.
To be sure, we are behind, and will be behind for some time in manned flight. But we do not intend to stay behind, and in this decade, we shall make up and move ahead.
When a rocket went off, people would start to yell, "Missile! Missile!" and run outside to see it. Now, you know, it seems odd now when I think about it, but at the time, we'd all run out there, dressed or not. You'd find people in their bathrobes, sheets wrapped around them. There was a little girl down the street one time who ran out of her house. I guess she'd been in the bath and she just had a washcloth, you know, held up against her chest. But everybody wanted to see the rocket.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
that goal to land a man on the moon and return him to Earth safely by the end of the decade was ever present. It wasn't as if someone was beating you on the head with it. It was something, at least for me, and I think for almost everyone, which was inside. We were pushing ourselves.
In Apollo 1, I was going to be the flight director of the first major test where they were going to do a real live countdown. We'd been having a lot of routine troubles. I mean, any early countdown of vehicles, both the launch, the rocketry and the spacecraft itself, we'd had a lot of problems with various kinds, systems problems. We had a lot of trouble with the communication system. By the time they got the spacecraft pressurized, it was about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon in Houston, and suddenly, after everything was sort of calm and nothing going on to speak of anything, they were checking out various things on the vehicle, and you heard this, we got a fire in here.
It all happened so fast, just a matter of seconds. I did see a shaking going on. I did see some cables move. And then we could tell, there was silence from the spacecraft, something had happened.
You heard all this emergency procedural talk. You heard the people in the blockhouse. You heard the people on the pad saying things and jumping, or you could tell it was jumping around. You could hear in the background from that, you could hear the crew making noises and some screams. And one of them, I think I remember one of them saying, "I'm on fire," or something like that. You knew almost immediately that it was very serious, and you had prayers in your head that they would survive, but knew that they probably hadn't. When they got the hatch open, I heard them ask, "Well, what are the astronauts' condition?" And they said, "Well, you don't want to hear us," words to that effect, because you looked inside the spacecraft and it was dead char inside there.
The fire made those of us that were involved in the program realize that we were not infallible. And the night after the fire, we had dinner and had too much to drink. We then, in the culmination of the evening, threw all our glasses in the fireplace, rather like the old World War I movies, had an enormous hangover and then got on to work. But that ended it for us. A lot of the people that hadn't been involved in tragedies before never did kick the drinking problems or the emotional problems that were associated with that tragedy.
All the materials had to be reanalyzed and fire tested, and we redesigned all kinds of things, and it was a very, very serious question. Of course, were we going to still be able to make the goal of landing on the moon given this incredible setback? As we worked our way through it, it began to look as though it was still possible, but everything would have to work right. And of course, that tightened the race that much more. I mean, we had basically 3 flights that had to work essentially perfectly if we were going to land on the moon on the 4th flight, and we could just barely get those in before the end of the decade. So it got to be a very tight race, but again, it energized everybody because it was possible, and by damn, we're going to do it.
was proposed by George Low that we consider going to the moon. Our initial reaction to that was, well, that's a pretty tough job to do, and we're not sure we can do that. But after talking to some of my colleagues in flight operations, they thought about it for a day or so, and they came back extremely enthusiastic about the job. They thought it was a tremendous challenge. They thought it was a great thing to do. They thought it was really something that would advance the state of the knowledge that we had, and they felt like if we could go in orbit around the moon, we would really have a leg up then on the lunar landing that we were going to do later.
I think that the decision to send Apollo 8 to the moon was affected by our desire to get to the moon first. There had been reports through the CIA that the Russians were preparing for a lunar flyby by the end of '68, and I think that that affected the mission for Apollo 8.
'1968 was an incredible and a very debilitating year in American history, with the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Vietnam War, turmoil on the college campus. The country seemed to be coming apart. You had two Americas from our point of view in NASA at that time, because NASA was almost untouched by that, because at the same time of this ferment all across America, you had technological accomplishment.
Going to the moon, of course, other than going around the Earth, there is a lot of differences. There's no rescue capability of any sort. And I broke the news to my wife, Marilyn, when I got back to Houston. We had planned to spend Christmas in Mexico, as a matter of fact. And of course, we were going to be launched earlier. So I said, no, I don't think I want to go to Mexico. I think for over the Christmas holidays, I think I'll go to the moon.
Knowing that that vehicle then was going to go to the moon for the first time, that we were going to leave the Earth's gravitational field, that man was going to see the moon for the first time, that we were going to go in orbit around another body, all of those things were flashing through our mind, I'm sure, as that vehicle was sitting on the pad and getting ready to go. It was a tremendous feeling.
0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have cleared the tower.
Roger. Running here, Houston. That's clear. Following Houston, you are go for staging, over. Roger, understand, sir.
For Borman and myself, old hat, this was Anders' first flight. But the spacecraft looked like it checked out perfectly. Everybody on the ground thought it was okay.
And Borman says we've got Seco. Cutoff was right on the 2nd. Apollo 8, Houston. Go ahead, Houston. Apollo 8, you are go for TLI, over. Roger, understand. We're going for tail right. Ignition. And the thrust is okay, booster says.
I was the navigator and inputted the computer all the parameters to relight the engine and everything, and we lit the engine. Then we watched the computer and the display count rapidly up as the velocity got faster and faster and faster and faster. And finally, when it shut down exactly like it should, you know, I mean, we were really going fast, almost, 25,000 miles an hour at that time. And when we finally separated and turned around and looked at the Earth, it was quite a sight.
Give us clues to what it looks like from way up there.
This is a beautiful, beautiful view with predominantly blue background and just huge covers of white clouds. This transmission is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We've been 31 hours, about 20 minutes into flight. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon.
On the Apollo 8 flight, it took us about 3 days to get there, a little less than 3 days. But the last day, we had the blunt end of our spacecraft pointed towards the moon in preparation for lighting the engine to slow down and to get captured by the moon's gravity. Therefore, we did not see the moon grow rapidly as we got closer to it. And the ground called up and said, at such and such a time, you will lose communication with us because the moon will start to pull you around to the far side because of its gravity.
Apollo 8, this is Houston at 6804, your go for LOI. Okay, Apollo 8 is go. You're riding the best bird we can find. We'll see you on the other side.
I was the one that talked everybody into going into orbit around the moon in the first place. And then sitting there and wondering whether the rocket had fired, whether it fired well, whether the navigation guidance system worked properly, and whether they were going to show up on their way back to the Earth was a damn long 30 minutes for me.
When we lit the engine, which was perhaps the most dramatic moment, because remember, we were a satellite of the moon. Should that engine fail to function, we would still be a satellite of the moon. And consequently, since I was a navigator, I put in all the parameters, and 5 seconds before the engine would light, a display on the computer comes up and essentially says, do you really want to make this maneuver? And if you do, you hit the proceed button. I hesitated for a little bit, and Borman said, hit the proceed button, go, go. The computer lit the engine. We slowed down. The computer then said we were in lunar orbit, but we looked out the windows, and all we could see is blackness. Where is this moon? What happened to it? And then we rotated the spacecraft around 180 degrees, and there, just 60 miles below, were the ancient old craters of the far side of the moon.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. There's a cheer in this room. This is Apollo Control Houston, switching now to the voice of Jim Lovell.
By 60.5, good to hear your voice. Apollo 8 Houston, what does the old moon look like from 60 miles, over?
Okay, Houston, the moon is essentially gray, no color, looks like plaster of Paris, or sort of a grayish beach sand. You can see quite a bit of detail. The craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them. Some of them are newer. Many of them look like, especially the round ones, look like hit by meteorites or projectiles of some sort.
We were like three school kids looking into a candy store window. We forgot the flight plan. We were just looking at those ancient craters as they slowly slipped by underneath us. And you know, then finally, as we came around the moon for the very first time, Borman and I were sort of looking ahead at the horizon. Anders was in charge of photography, so his job was to take pictures on the far side. And suddenly, out of the horizon came the Earth. Beautiful sight. Well, Frank and I said, we have to take a picture of this. Anders, who heard that comment, said, no, no, we have only so many frames of film. We must put them all here on the moon. And then Bill looked up and said, oh, we've got to take a picture of this. All three of us had cameras. All three of us took pictures. One of them became very famous. I think just about everybody in the world has seen it. It's called Earthrise. It was made into a stamp in 1969. Now, if you go around and meet Frank Borman, ask him who took the picture. He will say, I was the commander. Obviously, it's my photograph. If you happen to talk to Bill Anders, who took that picture, he'll say, I was the photographer. That is my photo. But, ladies and gentlemen, let it be known here and now, it was I who took that picture.
I kid Bill Anders about it, that he had all of the film allocated and wouldn't you waste any on aesthetics. But he denies that and claims that he takes it. It's a point of open contention now about who took the picture. Actually, I think Bill did.
Loneliness up here on the moon is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth. The Earth from here is a grand oasis in the big vastness of space.
I could put my thumb up to the window of the spacecraft and completely hide the Earth behind my thumb. Now, you have to think about that for a moment. Everything that you've ever known, all your loved ones, your career, the whole world, all the world's problems, the wars and everything else is behind your thumb. And you realize then just how insignificant we are, that the Earth is merely a planet around a rather normal star tucked away in the outer part of one galaxy, and we're only one of millions of galaxies.
Give us, O God, the vision which can see thy love in the world in spite of human failure. Give us the faith to trust the goodness in spite of our ignorance and weakness. Give us the knowledge that we may continue to pray with understanding hearts. And show us what each one of us can do to set forward the coming of the day of universal peace. Amen.
The key memory that I have of the Apollo 8 flight was looking back at the Earth. And the nostalgia, and the Christmas Eve, everything that we held dear 240,000 miles away, it was clear that that was the high point of the entire mission for me. I forget the technical end of it. At that point, the aesthetics and the memories, and the view of the Earth. It was the only place in the whole universe that had any color. Everything else was black and white. That was great.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
Several very, very prominent scientific people had postulated entirely different concepts of the lunar surface. One said that the surface was
was really a frothy type of fairy castles of rock and all that, of no structural substance. Another said that much of the surface were great pools of dust, and that if the landing happened to be in one of these pools, it would just sink down out of sight in all of this dust. Neither of those postulates were acceptable if we were going to land on the moon. And so we just thought about it and decided that neither one of those could be right, because how could great mountains exist on the moon if they have no structural substance? And how could there be great pools when clearly something, where would have all the dust come from in the first place to make all the pools? And that's when we decided that the surface, at least we sure God hoped the surface was not unlike the Sonora Desert or places like that on Earth.
We created a special training vehicle which would simulate, from the standpoint of the way the vehicle flew, the 1/6 gravity of the moon. On one occasion, when Armstrong was flying the lunar training vehicle, there was a problem. Somewhere in the control system, the thing started to dump. Fortunately, we had an ejection seat on that thing, and he ejected safely. And of course, we lost the lunar training vehicle. It crashed.
When NASA announced the crew, who they would be, Buzz got in touch with me, telling me personally that he was accepted as a member of the crew, and he was totally elated over being one of the crew to land on the moon.
My reaction was complete and absolute terror. I couldn't imagine his doing such a thing, even though I remembered that he had talked about it on our first date, but I never thought it would ever happen. Even when he got into the space program, I thought, well, they're never going to go to the moon. That's ridiculous. That's, you know, that's for comic books.
Buzz and Joan came over to our house for dinner one evening, and after dinner, Buzz and I walked outside, and there was a full moon. And we stood there and looked at the moon, and then Buzz said, well, in just a few months, I'm going to be right over there.
In many ways, the observation that I made to myself before the mission was it would be much more comfortable to be on a later flight and enjoy things a lot more than being on the first flight. Unfortunately, I didn't have that option to make that request. That's about the last request you'd probably make if you said that.
When I would be alone and I would start to think about it, think about Buzz going to the moon, and that even though he said everything was going to be fine, how did he know that? And I wrestled with a lot of demons during that period of time.
Fear comes in many different forms. It's horrible to be lonely, to fear loneliness. Now, is that more important than the fear of a locomotive running over you because your car is stuck on a crossing. They're both petrifying, I'm sure. One is emotional and the other is physical danger. I really don't think, and speaking for myself, that the physical fear was a part of Apollo at all. There was a good bit of emotional fear and psychological fear. But that's not what people, I think, are referring to. And that's certainly not the kind of thing that we're going to just volunteer our emotional fears.
Neil Armstrong, Commander, Apollo 11. Michael Collins, Command Module Pilot. Edwin Buzz Aldrin, Lunar Module Pilot.
And the night before the launch, Buzz called me. It was, well, by the time we finished the conversation, I was crying. I think he was too. It was a very, very touching, the things that he said. Buzz is not a person who expresses himself, his emotions well. But he, in effect, was telling me and the children that, you know, if by some chance something happened to him, you know, that we should know that he loved us and that we were important to him. In effect, that's pretty much what it was. But coming from Buzz, knowing him as I did at that time, I was truly, well, I was moved to tears.
Getting ready for a mission, to a great extent, was a ritual with me. I'm a Catholic, and I would go to church the morning of the mission, the morning of a major event. Then I would come home, and I had my wife, which is a tradition I established back in the Mercury program, would make me a brand new white vest for each one of the missions that I was to fly. She had a pattern, and I would wear this vest for the first time for that particular mission. I'd go out to the control room, control center, and I would walk through the back rooms, and I would try to get the sense of the feeling for the individuals. Were they concerned? Were they confident? Were they on top of the job? Were they tired? Were they communicating well with each other? Was there any particular thing that was bothering them? And they knew that, hey, this was the team that was going to go do the job, and we were going to go to the moon that day. And we didn't have to talk about it. We just knew it. We had that sense, that bonding, that feeling, that communication.
The people in our group had to be volunteers, because when we went out to the spacecraft on Apollo, for instance, the rocket was completely fueled, which had a blast potential of 0.8 of an atomic bomb. That's the reason you would find nobody else around for 3.5 miles. The rocket being fully fueled, it sits there and kind of groans and moans, and every once in a while it will scare the daylights out of you when a big sheet of ice slides down the side of a rocket and crashes down. So you have the feeling it's actually as a beast that's alive, wanting to go.
was at a little reception with Tom Paine, who was then the administrator of NASA. And we had word that a wagon train headed by the Reverend Jose Williams and others had assembled at a field near the main gate of Cape Canaveral.
We needed to make a statement and bring the plight of the poor down to the Space Center. And my father was particularly saying to America that it's time that America pay attention to the poor people in this country. And that it was ironic that we could afford to spend billions of dollars on a space program to send a man to the moon, but yet we could not feed poor people here on Earth.
Our group would see to it that the crew at the last minute and on the last day, when they show up, we would put them in the spacecraft, strap them down, apply all the hoses and the electrical connections, check it out once more, then go ahead, close the hatch, and run a cabin leak check. So somewhere along the line, some of the astronauts had the impression I was very much like a dictator. It actually started out with John Glenn, who just named me the Pad Führer. And then Pete Conrad later on, when he talked to Armstrong one time, and Armstrong asked how to get along with me, Pete said, oh, it's real simple, just do whatever he tells you. And Armstrong says, now what can he do if I just go ahead and throw a switch? Oh, Pete said, oh, nothing so, he just steps on your fingers.
It was a hot, dusty day, and we went to the gate and parked our car and took our jackets off and our ties and rolled our sleeves up. It was awfully hot, and we walked across this large field, and it was like the two of us facing this army. And Tom Paine said, if stopping the launch would do anything to solve your problems, I would have the launch stopped. And we said to Reverend Abernathy, this is a moment of great pride for all Americans, and will you join us?
I can remember my father being invited in to view the actual launching of this rocket, and him requesting that I come along with him. And we went into a VIP section of the center, and it was an experience that I would never forget.
We're on time at the present time for our planned liftoff of 32 minutes past the hour. Coming up shortly, that swing arm up at the spacecraft level will come back to its fully retracted position. This should occur at the 5-minute mark in the count. The swing arm now coming back as our countdown continues. Skip Chauvin informing the astronauts that the swing arm now coming back.
Senator Kennedy was invited to come to the launch. It had been his brother's commitment to land men on the moon, and we thought it was very appropriate. He chose not to come. I believe at the time he seemed to feel that it was Mr. Nixon and Mr. Agnew's party, and he should not sit in the stands and participate at the Cape.
We are still go with Apollo 11. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds.
I personally am sorry that he was not there, because I always felt that his brother would have wanted him to be there.
11, 10, 9, ignition sequence start.
ECS.
Go.
EPS.
Go.
Sequencer.
Go.
Generate
network.
SCS.
Go.
SPS.
Go.
most dangerous portion of the mission is the potential of running into the tower. In other words, the rocket doesn't go straight up, but it begins to go off to one side. Because if you collide with the tower, it's going to rip apart all the fuel and the oxidizer, and there's going to be a very big explosion right away. So that's the concern, I think, that everyone has, and they're anxious to hear the call out, tower clear. I think what did surprise us was that we really couldn't detect the moment of liftoff all that clearly. There was just the slightest hint of a swaying back and forth because of the guidance that would be steering the rockets. And of course, that would be all that slight a movement that you wouldn't see it from the ground. You might feel it from the spacecraft, or you might imagine it. And I guess all three of us imagined the same thing.
Clear the tower.
Tower clear, 13 seconds.
I can remember the rocket taking off, a memory that I would never forget. The loud sound and the boom. It was an experience that I have never experienced anything like it in my life since then.
I had seen lots and lots of launches on television, but what got me was something that the Capcom said, that he said on every flight. Always, the last thing the Capcom would say is Godspeed. And that still brings tears to my eyes, because I don't know what it was about Godspeed that I just felt as though, you know, that's all that you could say.
You know, it all comes to play at that time. There's no more politics, no more frustration. That's it. You're going to commit. But you coolly know that one little thing, anywhere in a journey, can bring it to an end.
Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight. Good luck and Godspeed.
About halfway through the mission, there was a little bell on the AP wire in the office signifying an urgent story. And I remember going over and looked, and there was this chap, I couldn't even pronounce it. Chappaquiddick. I didn't know, I couldn't even pronounce it. It said something about a car driven by Senator Kennedy had driven off a bridge and a young lady had drowned.
Our unit is en route, incident 3724.
13843, 13843, go to Simplex, the air unit.
I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately.
What happened, instead of coming to the launch, he chose to go home. Chappaquiddick occurred that weekend, changed the course of, I think, the Kennedy family history, perhaps his own history.
As Apollo 11 was on its way to the moon, the Russians announced that they were sending a probe, an unmanned probe, to the moon. And I was in Washington, and I got a call from Chris Kraft. He said, you know, in a kind of a cynical way, well, your friends are sending something to the moon. I hope it isn't going to follow us up. Can you find out what's going on? So we sent a fax over to, or not a fax then, but I guess a telex then, to the Soviets. And they responded with a complete trajectory and an assurance that it would not be in any way involved with the 11 trajectory. And I'm told it was the first time that they ever publicly announced any of the details of any of their trajectories.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. Looks like it's going to be impossible to get away from the fact that you guys are dominating all the news back here in Earth. Even Pravda in Russia is headlining the mission and calls Neil the czar of the ship. I think maybe they got the wrong mission.
We're 10 minutes away from ignition on translunar injection.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for TLI, over. Hello there. An ancient legend says a beautiful Chinese girl called Chang'o has been living there for 4,000 years. It seems she was banished to the moon because she stole the pill of immortality from her husband. You might also look for her companion, a large Chinese rabbit, who is easy to spot since he is always standing on his hind feet in the shade of a cinnamon tree. The name of the rabbit is not reported.
I felt awed by the responsibility of the mission, and that awe resulted in a tunneling in of vision. You're not as exuberant, as freewheeling with everything around you when you're very focused on what you're doing. I wish there was more time to pick the daisies, so to speak. But I think it's a tribute to the training that we have and to the discipline that I grew up with that said to me, hey, look, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you, but you better not be daydreaming and looking out the window when you're supposed to be doing something else.
I tend to be an emotional guy. I tend to try to make my people see in technicolor what we're going to do. So as we came up on the moon, in fact, we had been on shift. We had done all of the checks in the spacecraft. The command and service module had gone around the backside of the moon, and then I asked everybody to go over to what the loop was called, AFD conference.
And he said, all right, attention, everybody. And I thought, this is sort of strange. Because we'd never done this in any symptom. I wonder what he's going to tell us. Maybe there's an announcement I didn't know about. Maybe I missed something while I was out. And he made one of the most stirring speeches I've ever heard in my life. I mean, General Patton would have been proud of this speech.
And I told them I was very proud of them as individuals. I really enjoyed the times that we had worked together in getting ready for this mission. We had had some good times and some bad times. But we were the team that was going to go to the moon. There was no question about it. And that throughout this entire process, I wanted to let them know how valuable I felt was their contribution.
And then he said something I'll remember all my life. He said, but no matter how it turns out, I'm behind you, and I'll be with you. And I'll tell you what, that for a young kid that's not too sure anyway, because, you know, we're about to do the biggest thing we've ever done in our lives, all of us, and for a bunch of young flight controllers, that had to be the best thing he could have said at the time.
Then I hung up the loop. We went to what we call battle short. Battle short is an interesting condition that we set up for the control centers. We want no electrical power interruptions. So as we went to battle short, we actually put physical blocks over the circuit breakers in the building. We would prefer to burn up a circuit rather than have that circuit go out. And as soon as they identified they were in battle short, we locked the doors of the room. And we locked the doors so there's no disturbance. Nobody's going to walk in on us at a critical time. So we finished the talk and AFD conference, we went to battle short, we locked the doors, and we were ready.
Position 2, all flight controllers, 20 seconds to go, no go for landing.
Things went wrong right off the bat. We came around the side of the moon. As we came around, communications were terrible. Could hardly hear the crew. I could read half my computer parameters. Sometimes I'd get a few seconds of good data, then they'd go bad. I was wondering if we were going to have enough data to actually let us start the landing.
Okay, all flight controllers, go, no go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand, go for landing, 3,000 feet.
Crew started the engine, descent started. Comm started to get a little better. Things started to look up a little bit. And the minute we got good communications, I looked at one of my displays, and the first solid data I had, we had a navigation error of 20 foot per second in the computer.
I remember hearing a little bit of discussion about that Neil was having with the ground. The landmarks that he expected at a certain time were not coming exactly when he thought they were. And I marvel that one is able to do that with the eyeball. I thought, too, well, he's got to be joking. He didn't really mean that.
Now, that doesn't sound like much, but if that error would have grown to 35 foot per second, I would have had to stop this mission and abort it.
Into the ag, 47 degrees. Roger. 47 degrees.
How's our margin looking, Bob?
It looks okay. We're about 4.5.
Roger.
Eagle looking great. Your go.
30 seconds later, 1201, program alarm.
1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
Same type, we're go flight.
I was still so much thinking about the navigation error, I was thinking, what? 1201, what is that? What is that?
The computer kept saying, hey, I cannot do all of the jobs you're asking me to do. Well, this put a real load upon the controllers because we had to figure out what the computer was not doing.
We're go. Same type, we're go.
So we proceeded on that alarm, and it didn't come right back again, indicating that it wasn't all that serious. But the people on the ground, in rather quick order, were able to give us a go on that alarm.
How you doing?
35 degrees. We look good. You're fine.
How about you, Telcom? Go. Guidance, you happy?
Go.
Go.
And all of this occurred after we'd reached the 500 feet above the ground. That was the point that the commander was going to take over manual control for the landing.
And then something really strange starts to happen. Instead of stopping and hovering and going down like the way that I've seen them in simulations, they're doing a lot of search or forward motion.
I don't think anything that he could have seen would have identified where we were or where we weren't, where we didn't know where we were, really.
540 feet down to 30, down to 15. 300 feet down, 3.5. 47 forward.
There is no fuel gauge in the LEM spacecraft. And it'd say you got 2 minutes of fuel remaining. We would then count down, and we would normally land at 2 minutes. So we got down to a minute, and we still hadn't landed. So we gave the crew the 60-second call.
6 forward.
60 seconds.
60 seconds.
We didn't know why he wasn't sitting down. We didn't know whether he couldn't see because of the dust, or he wasn't satisfied with something in the spacecraft. He didn't say much. Neil never said much. We were used to that, expecting that.
Head 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Forward.
I was totally focused upon the clock. And coming to this point in the mission where we were so close that we would have to give the crew the call at 0. When we hit 0, that was the crew lands now or aborts now. And we were watching that clock count down. If you ever have felt the time just stood still, each second seemed like an eternity there.
3.5 down, 9 forward. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Be advised, there are lots of smiling faces in this room and all over the world, over. There are 2 of them up here.
I felt so focused in on doing exactly what was the most important for mission success, and somehow telling the Earth that we had landed was not that important. But there was a moment, I can't tell you exactly what second it was, that I just reached over and patted him on the back. But we didn't say anything.
We had landed now, and in this control center, there's a viewing room that is behind my console. It's separated by 2 panes of glass with airspace in between. The people in the viewing room started cheering and applauding and clapping and stomping their feet, and this sound sort of seeped into the control room here. Our instructors were off in a room to their right. They were cheering there. And yet we couldn't relax at all because we had to take a look at the spacecraft systems. We had to get ready for what we call our time 1 stay no stay decision. Was it safe now to stay on the moon for several minutes, or should we abort back off again? And I had to start another go. And I found I had grabbed onto the handles on the TV in my console in almost a death grip. I mean, it was just holding on there, holding on to the console, and the other one had a pencil. And I have a logbook I was writing in, and I could not speak. As soon as that sound came in there for 1 or 2 seconds, I was paralyzed. And I finally was so frustrated because I had to get on with the T1 stay no stay decision. So I banged my hand on the console, and my pencil broke and flew up in the air. And I just got over that personal climax in a couple seconds, and then we went back to business of committing the crew to the extended stay on the surface of the moon.
Back in 1969, I wrote a letter to the astronauts. And I thought maybe it might be better if I would remind them of how the moon is important to Hopi. And the main thing is the respect that they should have for the moon and not to dirty it in any manner.
I never thought that Buzz was as deeply religious as I found out during that period of time. He had made these plans to take communion on the moon. At first I thought it was a little presumptuous, but I'm not Catholic, but I was raised as an Episcopalian. And you know, you don't give yourself communion. I figured, you know, well, how else is he going to do it if he's going to do it? But it was a surprise to me.
And I remember glancing at Neil when I poured the white wine out of the little piece of plastic container. The wafer was in a plastic wrap, sealed up also. But I can just remember looking at him and getting that unusual look at watching what I was doing.
We had immediately said, well, let's get them some rest when we get to the moon, and we knew that damn well probably wouldn't work. How in the hell are you going to tell these guys that, hey, go to sleep and we'll wake you up and then you can go walk on the moon? We already knew that wasn't a good plan.
Okay, Houston, I'm on the porch. Roger, Neil.
I was in absolute awe of the fact that man was now about ready to walk in this moon, and it was a sense of accomplishment. It was a sense of exploration. It was a sense of the United States of America. It was a sense of pride, perfection. I mean, it's almost impossible to describe all of the feelings. It was very emotional, very intense time.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder. The surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder ground mass. Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. It's adequate to get back up. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Being out of it and being closer to the moon makes us realize that we're all human beings together.
I hope this brings unity amongst all countries. This means a lot to all the countries, not just for America.
Myself, I'm really interested to see what's up there.
The dream of the man from the beginning of the human race is coming now.
The elation that we all felt was a culmination of 10 years, and in some cases a lot longer than that, of very, very difficult work. And it represented, at least in my opinion, it represented to the American society a kind of a culmination for several years of really rotten internal domestic politics and student uprisings, all precipitated by the Vietnamese War. I think it was almost a cleansing, or at least a reaffirmation that as a country we weren't completely in disarray.
Yeah, I was extremely happy, and happy just sort of overfills, and it just comes pouring out, and that's it. And I'm embarrassed, but I'm standing in front of this whole bunch of people, and everybody's wondering, what the heck's he crying?
It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
Neil, this is Houston. Did you copy about the contingency sample, over?
All right, you're going to get to that just as soon as I finish these picture series.
Fair enough.
Like it's a little difficult to dig through the initial crust. Very interesting. It's a very soft surface, but here and there where I plug with the contingency sample collector, I run into very hard surface, but it appears to be very cohesive material of the same sort. Okay, ready for me to come out? All set. Okay, I'm on the top step. It's a very simple matter to hop down from one.
Buzz was affected by the fact of learning that he was not going to be the first one to step on the lunar surface.
You've got 3 more steps and then a long one. Okay, I'm gonna leave that
I think all the attention focused in on that regrettably promoted a disharmony among our crew. There was a bit more of a pressure being the prime crew, and that pressure was irritated. It was exasperated by the issue of who would be first and second. And we were the innocent pawns, I think, in that whole issue.
That's a good step.
When my foot hit the ground, dust went up, and it all hit in a ring. And it doesn't do that on the Earth. There's a sort of a billowing. And I can't really explain why it does that, but I did it a couple of times, and each time I did it, my foot went down, and then out from it would the little clods in different sizes would all hit about the same, not too many short, not too many long, all about the same distance out.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation. Don't forget when you finish the panorama. You're going too fast on the panorama sweep. I haven't set it down yet.
And the first thing that I thought when I saw the television was that it was a scene from a Walt Disney movie, because it was grainy, and you could tell that there were figures walking there, but they walked like marionettes. The movement was jumpy, and they looked like cartoon characters in black and white.
Isn't it time? Hey, Neil, didn't I say we might see some purple rocks? Find the purple rocks? Yep. Very small, sparkly fragments.
We're very conscious of the fact that television was watching what we were doing, and if television wasn't watching it, people were listening very, very intently to the least little murmur that came from the moon. And you know what that does? I think that tunnels your vision in. When you know that every little grunt that you make is going to be recorded, you parcel those observations out very carefully. And to two relatively reticent people, it ends up kind of clamming them up. They don't say very much. And we didn't.
Originally, the president had decided, of course, that this was going to be a mission from the planet Earth to the moon. And the thought of making it anything less than the whole Earth by planting an American flag there didn't seem to fit into that scenario. But people got to thinking more about why shouldn't there be an American flag? After all, we had put an awful lot of money into this job.
When we went to put the flag in, it didn't want to stay because we couldn't get the pole in very far. It wasn't sharpened enough to really penetrate, and there wasn't enough cohesiveness to the walls of the surface of the moon to hold it, unless you maybe kicked it with your foot. Then it might pat down and be compact enough. But we know there wasn't any wind up there that was going to blow it over.
They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface. Beautiful, just beautiful.
One of the things that we cranked into the plan was to place a phone call, which, of course, the president did, in which he said this is the most historic phone call ever made.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made.
The crew was not really surprised, but they were pleased to have a call from the president. And I had made sure, I thought, that there were a lot of questions that the president could ask, so they would have a nice dialogue. I don't think that I really counted on the sort of Gary Cooper style of Neil Armstrong, who, while he didn't say yep to every question, his answers were very short.
It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but men of peace of all nations, and with interest and a curiosity and with a vision for the future.
It caught me totally by surprise. if it had been mentioned, it was in such an informal way that it might take place, that it didn't sink in. And I felt rather ill-prepared to respond in front of millions of people to the president at that time. And I felt, gee, I just wish I'd known about that a little bit ahead of time. Not that it made that much difference.
All right, you do have to be rather careful to keep track of where your center of mass is. Sometimes it takes about 2 or 3 paces to make sure that you've got your feet underneath you. And about 2 or 3 or maybe 4 easy paces can bring you to a fairly smooth stop. Like a football player, you just have to put out to the side and cut a little bit. So-called kangaroo hop does work, but it seems your forward ability is not quite as good.
Every moment that they were on the lunar surface was nerve-wracking for me. I just wanted the mission to end. I wanted them to join up with my college, the 3 of them to be together, to come back home, land safely, and get it all over with. And I kept saying to myself, "You've done it. You've done it. You know, don't overplay your hand."
Tranquility Base, Houston. Guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff.
Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway.
My stomach was churning at the thought of that LEM having one engine and had to lift off and get those men back to the mother craft. This, to me, was the most harrowing experience.
After we came in from our EVA on the surface and were stowing everything away, I noticed on the floor of the cabin, on my side of the cabin, that there was a broken end of a circuit breaker. Clearly, it was the end of the plastic end of the circuit breaker, and so I was wondering just which circuit breaker it was. So I looked along the rows, and strangely enough, it was the engine arm circuit breaker. I felt that I could either push it in, and just like any other circuit breaker, it would stay in, but if I ever had to pull it out again, I would be in trouble, because I couldn't grab hold of anything. Gene Kranz and others on the ground told us afterward that in those hours they learned more about alternate ways to get that engine started if that circuit breaker didn't stay in when we pushed it in. But fortunately it did.
7, 6, 5, wait stage, engine arm ascent.
When the ascent stage of the LEM blasted off, that was quite a shocker, because when all the pieces of insulation just went, it looked like an explosion, and for a split second I thought, my God, it's blown up.
There was a hell of a wind of rocket exhaust that went in all directions, and Neil wanted to sort of keep that quiet, the fact that he had seen the flag blow over when we lifted off. He thought that would kind of ruin the moment for somebody when they leave to knock over the flag. It seems a little clumsy, perhaps, but
It's hard to really keep your perspective in this room, because you're surrounded by absolutely incredible individuals accomplishing great events against extremely large odds. I mean, it's just it finally comes together here, and when you see something like the moonwalk, you say, God, this is what living's all about.
there was a lot of dust all over our suits, and even though we'd brushed each other off, a lot of that dust came in on our boots and was on the floor. And once we took the helmets off, I think we both noticed a distinct pungent odor in the cabin, a good bit like wet charcoal or wet ashes from a fire. And I guess we'd have to attribute it to the presence of the lunar material.
Alan Bean did say one thing that I thought was interesting, and I laughed about it later. He said to me, you know, once Buzz comes back from the moon, your lives will never be the same. And as far as Buzz is concerned, he'll have the whole world at his feet. At the time, it sounded pretty good. A year later, I wasn't so sure that I wanted that kind of a life, and I know that Buzz didn't at first. I know he didn't.
Apollo 11, Houston, with a little recovery force information, over.
Go ahead.
Roger, the Hornet is on station, just far enough off the target point to keep from getting hit. There's blackout. Velocity 33,000 feet per second. 35,000 feet per second now. Feet per second. We're at entry time. Hornet reports a sonic boom a short time ago. Apollo 11, Houston through Orion. Apollo 11, Houston through Orion, standing by. Over. Strokes.
Coming down, once the parachutes are open, the next maybe sensation that you have is that you start breathing in salt air. when the pressure outside is greater than the pressure inside, the outside air begins to vent on in, and you get that odor of salt air, and that's a noticeable thing. You know you're home when you smell that salt water. The next thing that happened after we hit the water was that we hit pretty hard, because it was a little bit rougher seas than maybe we had expected. And the way that we hit made it difficult for us to jettison the parachutes. They had pulled us over and we were upside down. We came within that close of getting seasick. That's not the way to come back from the moon, to barf in the spacecraft before you get picked up.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over. Apollo 1, this is Apollo 11, reading your last course. Our position 1330, 6915.
And there's a feeling of absolute, total exhaustion. When we get the crew on the carrier, that is when you really realize how tired you are. It's sort of like somebody had taken a great big bottle filled with all of the emotions, the challenges, the risks, and all of those things, and then immediately pulled the plug and everything drains out of it. That's exactly how you feel in this, when the mission's over. You really feel like, you heard the term drain, that's what it's all about. But it's a good feeling. It's a feeling that now, we did what we said we were going to do. We were truly professionals. We executed our plans perfectly. This is what the business is all about.
I really was so confident this time, as opposed to the way I felt yesterday, and I guess it really showed. I think I'm going to have about 3 or 4 days to really let it sink in. Of course I'm, in quotes, thrilled, proud, and happy. But it's so much more than that that I just can't find the words.
One of the remarkable things that I remember happening in the trailer, the flight surgeon who was in there with the 3 of us, he said that he had some tapes of the television programs that covered the broadcast during our landing and our flight. He said, would you like to see some of these? So on a small little television set, he started playing the commentators that were talking about our flight, whether it was the landing or whatever. And just so spontaneously, this thought crossed my mind, and I reached over to Neil and I said, hey, Neil, look, we missed the whole thing. And what I meant by that was far more than what popped into my mind, was that we were so interested in what was happening in the mission, see? But what was happening was not up there, it was happening back here. We were out of town for the most important parts of that mission. To me, the most important part of the mission was what happened in the minds of the people who witnessed that event. They will never forget that. We won't either. But something very important happened, and it wasn't up on the moon. It was a realization that humanity can do those kind of things.
They were all in the quarantine trailer together. They got into Houston quite late, and we were naturally all there to welcome them. And I had my turn at the microphone to talk to Buzz, because that was the only way we could communicate. And the first words he said to me was, I need some clean jockey shorts. And that just really broke me up. But I'm sure he planned to say that, but it was absolutely the perfect thing to say at that time.
My life changed not because of what I saw or did or experienced on the moon. My life changed because in the minds of other people around me, I went to the moon. And somehow I have to live up to that in some fashion, or I have to acknowledge that. I can't run away from that. That is a part of my life, and it started 25 years ago.
God, we were there. Why the heck did we surrender? Why did we not go back? Why have we become so complacent about exploration? Why do we not continue to pursue every opportunity to delve into the unknown, to unlock the mysteries? Why are we not sending our explorers not only to the moon, but on to Mars? It's really frustrating to see us there, and then all of a sudden just sit back and say, okay, it's all over. That's unacceptable to me.
I think that we were probably the luckiest people on the face of the earth in the last 500 years to be involved, and I feel a tremendous sense of accomplishment that we were able to do it, and wonder if we can do it again.
It was worth it. It was worth unfortunately, the lives that we lost. It was worth the dollars that we spent. And America was, I don't think it's been the same since then. We may not have it in the forefront of our minds, but this was the great American accomplishment.
I haven't heard too much about what they thought of the moon. But the only thing that I hear is that what man can do a lot of things and make it real. And that's probably what they did with the moon. Now that's just one planet, but they're certainly thinking about other planets, like the Mars, for instance. They'll probably get there eventually.
At least 170 German citizens were brought to trial and convicted in 1944 as participants in the last plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. It was not an isolated act, but only the last of over 20 attempts and plots to overthrow the Nazi leadership. Acts of individual conscience at war with an overpowering national consensus.
Was ich an politischen Erfahrungen persönlich gemacht habe, hat für mich mancherlei Schwierigkeiten in der Folge gehabt, weil ich ja sehr lange für das
I was working for a department in the central part of Florida, and we had a duty in an orange grove where there was people stealing oranges, and we had to stake it out to catch them. And I remember laying in that orange grove night after night and watching the Russian Sputnik go over. And there was a great feeling among everybody that I talked to in my police work that the United States could not be second. We could not be second. We knew that Russia was trying to put a man on the moon. We knew this. And it just seemed to be the criteria. We got to be first. We got to be first.
For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom, and therefore we intend to be first.
The first message that Gagarin got on his flight was, let the capitalist beat that. That until we landed men on the moon, the Russians would beat us in everything. They'd have the biggest rocket. They would have more men in space. They would have more accomplishments in space.
To be sure, we are behind, and will be behind for some time in manned flight. But we do not intend to stay behind, and in this decade, we shall make up and move ahead.
That would give light. So they found a hide, and as far as I can tell, it was a deer hide that they thought would brighten the earth. And so they did that, and when they made it, then they placed it up in the heaven dome.
There is a great future for humanity off planet, and we need to set about sharpening the skills that it takes for humans to learn how to live further and further away from the earth. One of these days, one of these years, one of these centuries, people will look back on these years and marvel. I don't think we really understand the significance of what happened 25 years ago.
You looked inside the spacecraft and it was dead char inside there.
The fire made those of us that were involved in the program realize that we were not infallible. And the night after the fire, we had dinner and had too much to drink. We then, in the culmination of the evening, threw all our glasses in the fireplace, rather like the old World War I movies, had an enormous hangover and then got on to work. But that ended it for us. A lot of the people that hadn't been involved in tragedies before never did kick the drinking problems or the emotional problems that were associated with that tragedy.
All the materials had to be reanalyzed and fire tested, and we redesigned all kinds of things. And it was a very, very serious question, of course, were we going to still be able to make the goal of landing on the moon, given this incredible setback? As we worked our way through it, it began to look as though it was still possible, but everything would have to work right. And of course, that tightened the race that much more. I mean, we had basically 3 flights that had to work essentially perfectly if we were going to land on the moon on the 4th flight, and we could just barely get those in before the end of the decade. So it
major test where they were going to do a real live countdown. We'd been having a lot of routine troubles. I mean, any early countdown of vehicles, both the launch, the rocketry and the spacecraft itself, we'd had a lot of problems with various kinds, systems problems. We had a lot of trouble with the communication system. By the time they got the spacecraft pressurized, it was about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon in Houston, and suddenly, after everything was sort of calm and nothing going on to speak of anything. They were checking out various things on the vehicle, and you heard this, we got a fire in here.
It all happened so fast, just a matter of seconds. I did see a shaking going on. I did see some cables move. And then we could tell, there was silence from the spacecraft, something had happened.
You heard all this emergency procedural talk. You heard the people in the blockhouse. You heard the people on the pad saying things and jumping. You could tell it was jumping around. You could hear in the background from that, you could hear the crew making noises and some screams. And one of them, I think I remember one of them saying, "I'm on fire," or something like that. You knew almost immediately that it was very serious, and you had prayers in your head that they would survive, but knew that they probably hadn't. When they got the hatch open, I heard them ask, "Well, what are the astronauts' condition?" And they said, "Well, you don't want to hear us," words to that effect, because
when a rocket went off, people would start to yell, "Missile! Missile!" and run outside to see it. Now, you know, it seems odd now when I think about it, but at the time we'd all run out there, dressed or not. You'd find people in their bathrobes, sheets wrapped around them. There was a little girl down the street one time who ran out of her house. I guess she'd been in the bath and she just had a washcloth, you know, held up against her chest. But everybody wanted to see the rocket.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
That goal to land a man on the moon and return him to Earth safely by the end of the decade was ever present. It wasn't as if someone was beating you on the head with it. It was something, at least for me, and I think for almost everyone, which was inside. We were pushing ourselves.
In Apollo 1, I was going to be the flight director of the first